agree. And actually, my commentary builds or fits really nicely with yours. So let's recognize that right-wing populism is mostly a scam. That even as Donald Trump or Tucker Carlson or Josh Hawley can occasionally and with great effect, and obviously much better than you'll hear from Nancy Pelosi or most MSNBC hosts, critique how capitalism is working. And yes, there are parties in Europe that, because of Europe's political traditions, are more likely to actually support social policies and fit that together with programs of extreme xenophobia, that at the end of the day, the policy trends, and we can see this over several years now, whether we're looking at the United States or Brazil or Hungary or India or Israel, is that these right-wing governments do not have a serious economic strategy. Let's focus on the United States. Look at the bailouts. The bailouts are a massive consolidation of wealth and power for the financial sector. They have almost no labor protections, no systemic relief for working people. This was the bill that was primarily devised by Mitch McConnell, happily signed by Donald Trump, and with a slush fund for like the comically corporatist hack who should have been charged by Kamala Harris, Steve Mnuchin, to oversee as Treasury Secretary. The main domestic policy accomplishment of the Trump administration, in addition to tons of executive orders, which have, as we all know, generated an enormous and brutal welfare on migrant and refugee populations, but also just on standard issue Republican stuff, making it easier to pollute, making it easier to hide, getting rid of protection around Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts. All those things through executive orders in the executive branch. The main policy achievement after trying to destroy Obamacare, we all know Obamacare, and they still are trying to destroy Obamacare. And we all know, of course, that Obamacare is nothing like a solution. The only way out of the healthcare crisis and the only humane answer is universal governmental healthcare for everybody in the United States. That being said, the main primary domestic push of Trump when he first got into office was try to get 30 million people, 20, 30 million people off of their health insurance, primarily by canceling Medicaid expansion, which was the most successful part and the most just part of Obamacare. They passed a huge tax cut bill that primarily went to the wealthy, and also have waged a relentless war against people who rely on food stamps. Now, we all know that where they go when they actually sort of diagnose the problems of inequality and the collapse of family structure and things like that is, of course, to nationalism and various rhetoric of blaming immigrants and diversity as a substitute for the problems caused by capitalism. And of course, we morally object to that and fight against that on humanitarian grounds. And this also reveals a total strategic divergence between a left or materialist answer to these problems and the right-wing scam that gets us there. And it also, again, is going to give us important lessons for how to build a left that might actually have some mass appeal and might have some sound strategic thinking. None of these right-wing figures in the United States are pro-labor union in any systemic way. They might occasionally hint at pro-labor policies, although rarely with any substantive follow-through, and certainly not from the Trump administration or most Republicans in Congress. They might occasionally say, yeah, maybe we should think about raising wages if they're in media, as an example. Or if they're Josh Hawley, they might do some very smart repatriation on supply chains, which we should be working on. But of course, you can't separate from their xenophobia and rush to create a dangerous Cold War with China. But when you push them on labor unions, and I'll cite again our friend Dustin Guastella, he says guys like Bannon, who make this big show of being different kinds of Republicans, they sound like country club types. They all of a sudden don't feel so comfortable about backing union policies. You've certainly never seen an actual right-wing populist move would be to say the Democrats have lied about supporting card check. We're going to support it. That might actually be a move of jujitsu, which you're never going to see. And let's actually look. I'm going to quote from a Jacobin piece in 2019 called On Trump's War on Workers. Let me just give you some examples of what Trump's administration actually has done with regards to labor itself. Trump has wasted no time in rolling back many of the rather mild labor regulations that are in place to give workers some level of protection. He supported the repeal of Obama's Fair Play and Safe Workplace executive order that protected workers from wage theft. Before Trump, workers had to earn $23,000 a year before the requirement of overtime pay kicked in. Now that requirement has been moved to $35,000, eliminating the opportunity for growing low-wage workers in the American economy. And for these same low-wage workers, Trump ran on supporting a $10 minimum wage and has not taken any action on it. Of course, Trump has also said at other times that American wages are too high. Yes, he renegotiated NAFTA with some slightly enhanced labor protections, but the overall structure of that trade deal doesn't change anything. And this is a really important point because a right-wing populist story is always going to need to go to cultural answers for economic and material problems at their roots. Now, to be really clear, and this is where the left can make mistakes, it's not about saying that family life doesn't matter or community life doesn't matter. If those things are constricted in a way that excludes certain families or says that only people from certain backgrounds or certain identities have a right to those things, then of course we fight against them completely. But at the same time, this isn't like this is where rhetoric about abolishing the family or things like that, some of the only places in life where people might potentially feel some refuge in today's world, is totally counterproductive and foolish sort of rhetoric to lead with. We have to say that the breakdown of community life, people not having free time, people not being able to build the lives they want, however they conceive it, is a big problem that we have answers to as well. But we understand that the base of why those problems are developing is because of massive inequality, increased work hours, a freelance economy, and basically capitalism. So, and I hope people can see the distinction I'm making here, because again, the liberal objection to this stuff is to point out the moral depravity of the sexism and the racism and all these other things, which we absolutely condemn and see as well. That's absolutely part of it. But we also have to look dispassionately at the real problems that these people are pointing to and then say, again, not only are the answers they're providing xenophobic, toxic, and bigoted, they also will fundamentally never work because they don't have an actual strategy to empower the only sustainable source of counterweight to capital, which is labor. And the only way of connecting an emergent left that takes place in a lot of areas like this, people consuming media, people with college backgrounds and so on, is to build out a left that can sort of run in tandem with a revived labor movement and think strategically in that way. And that means practically thinking about how we can best be of service of people who are going on strike, how we can not as sort of intervening liberals with good ideas or the right approach give other people strategy, but actually what the material conditions are demanding from people, the enormous risks and costs of that, and how we can be supportive of that. Now, fortunately, polls are changing. Labor unions, after being sort of under siege for decades, and of course they still are economically under siege, public opinion polls are changing. In 2019, look at this graph here. This is a significant upsurge in people's support of organized labor because they recognize that that's the only ground from which to have protection and for more bold goals like genuinely democratizing the economy or giving people actual say over their lives and how they live it. We recognize that labor is going to be the base of that. So in a way, we're lucky because this right-wing populism is doomed to fail as a project, but we can only seize on that opportunity if we get real and we get strategic and we leave these people in the dustbin of history where they belong.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that I would also bring up is the like right-wing populism is only perpetuated by the terrible messaging that comes from Democratic leadership. So, the example of Nancy Pelosi in front of her expensive refrigerators, that was very effectively used against the Democratic Party by members of the right. And so they're able to position themselves as individuals who are looking out for the best interests of working Americans, when in reality, behind the scenes, we know what they're capable of and we know what they've done. We know that they had absolutely no interest in creating more jobs or increasing wages by cutting taxes for the top 1%. $2 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and none of that money went toward improving the lives of employees. All it went toward was buying up stocks, right? The corporate stock buybacks. And so we also need to be mindful of the failure of messaging on the Democratic side. But I think that independent media can do a better job in just really highlighting what Tucker Carlson's really doing, right? And it reminds me of the debate I had with Ann Coulter a few years ago. At one point during the debate, she said this. She claimed that she was concerned about immigrants coming into the country because they're going to take fast food jobs away from Black people. So,
sure.
Because Ann Coulter, of all people, is very concerned about Black people. First off, boxing Black Americans into fast food work, and saying the real enemy here is, the immigrants who are coming in and taking these jobs away from them. No, I would argue that we have an entire economic structure that's the real problem here, and it's not working for anyone except for those at the top.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And again, as long as we leave those openings for them, we have to be able to answer, not just on grounds we're comfortable with. We have to be able to talk about things like community in the terms that we talk on them, which is inclusive, broad-based, and cosmopolitan, but also, receptive to different people's desires and how they want to live and how they want to do things. And then we also just need to relentlessly say, look, if you're concerned about fast food workers, then why don't you support paying everybody $25 an hour and single payer healthcare? And there really is no way around it. There is no coherent policy way around that. And the only way to ensure those gains, to protect those gains, is labor unions, which is why all the data we have from across the world shows higher labor union concentration in power increases living standards, period. It's undebatable, no matter how much propaganda says otherwise.